Today, my guest is author Michael Gross. We will be talking about his new nonfiction release from Broadway Books, Rogues Gallery, The Secret History of the Moguls and the Money That Made the Metropolitan Museum. Michael is a New York Times best-selling author and has written for numerous magazines and newspapers. He is as well a contributing editor at Travel and Leisure magazine. Well, Michael, I want to welcome you to the show. I'm so excited to have you with us today.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Well, you're very, very welcome. I had the pleasure of hearing you when you appeared at the Literary Society of the Desert, and I heard you speak on this book, and I'll tell you, this is really some book, and I know my listeners are going to enjoy it. I'm going to just give a little background on that book, and then we'll get into questions. So,
perfect.
Okay, your new book, as we'll repeat the title, Rogues Gallery, The Secret History of the Moguls and the Money That Made the Metropolitan Museum, is, as the book overleaf says, quote, an amazing 130 years history of the Met, focusing on its most colorful characters. Now, your opening statement is quite a shocker, because the opening statement also in the overleaf says, behind every painting is a fortune, and behind that, a sin or a crime. And that's the introduction to the story within this story. That is, it is an expose on how the Met tried to prevent you from publishing their secrets, making your book the first independent, unauthorized look at the saga of the nation's greatest museum. So we do have the story within the story. Your introduction starts out with some of the problems that you encountered and then gets into the history.
Well, I would call them challenges more than problems.
Oh, well, yes. For you, I would call them challenges. That's right. Other people, I'm sure, might have encountered similar things and just got scared away, and you did not. So let's start out, first of all, by asking you to tell my audience, how long did it actually take you to get the first meeting in 2006 to discuss the possibility of a book?
Oh, gee, that's a good question. Let's see. I think I started talking to the Met in the fall of 2005. So I would say it was probably a good 4 or 5 months between my first phone call to them, which basically led them to say to me, go away.
Mm-hmm.
And my eventually effective attempt to win a meeting with both the director and the president of the museum, at which the initial go away became definitive.
Well, we're going to get into that a little further also, because I think that's the interesting meat of the story, as well as the fascinating history. So here we go with the Met. It's defined as a public institution. The museum is in a building that is owned by the state on public land that is owned. All are maintained by the city of New York. They receive grants from taxpayers' money, yet they operate as a private society answering to no one. How is it possible that they were able to do that all of this time?
Well, it's ebbed and flowed. Initially, the museum was very much a closed shop and a private club for its founders, who were its trustees. In the 19th century, the newspapers in New York and politicians in New York actually pushed back very hard against the arrogance of the people who had founded the museum. It was a weaker museum than it is now, a weaker institution. But nonetheless, it had a lot of power. It had so much power that it was able to remain closed on Sundays, basically as a gesture of utter contempt towards the working class in New York, who only had Sundays off. And the rich guys who'd founded the museum said that they could not, in good conscience, open on Sundays because it was the Sabbath.
Right.
And this fight went on for years, with unions and politicians all saying that the museum had to open and threatening to cut off its funding. and the trustees simply stomping their feet and refusing. And the turning point in that long fight, which I learned about from a wonderful, wonderful doctoral dissertation that was written about it, came when an enterprising reporter noticed that there was a back door at the museum and that it was unlocked on Sundays for the trustees and their friends.
So
in fact, the museum was open, but only for the very people who said that it couldn't be. It still took a number of years more before they finally were forced to open on Sundays. And then there was a rather happier period where the city and the press got along with the museum. There are a lot of other reasons for the antagonism, but that was a really vital one, and it was the Sunday opening issue that really caused the first breach in the arrogance of the trustees.
Well, that's. I'm going to interrupt you here and say that actually, then the final answer to my question is arrogance and wealth and the heck with the public, and that is one thing. Certainly, I'm sure that another reason why they didn't want to talk to you, because they didn't want all of this history to come out.
Well, no, I think that really, they didn't want to talk to me because they don't want anyone to know how the sausage gets made.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
My entire career has been spent taking beautiful surfaces, flipping them over and seeing what went into their creation and what's going on behind the pretty facade.
Yes.
And, the Met was aware of what I do for a living, and they actually told me that one of the biggest black marks against me in terms of my request for their cooperation was the fact that I had written a book called 740 Park, which dealt with the private lives of some of New York's richest families. And it was the head of publicity of the museum said to me, "We don't want you poking and prodding into the deepest recesses of the private and philanthropic lives of our benefactors, donors, and trustees." And that was, in fact, precisely what I was going to do. So there was an immediate problem in terms of my wanting to do something that they considered to be anathema. But what was interesting was that subsequently, as I learned more and more about the history of the museum, I learned that this attitude was pervasive and that it was very much one of the foundations of the history of the museum, that a refusal to be transparent, a refusal to allow the public in, to allow the public to see what was going on, to even acknowledge the vital role of the public in the creation and the sustaining of the institution. These are all places where the Met has had a problem and continues to this day.
Well, this I think is a good point then to ask this question. Why did you decide to do the story? What was the first thing that you either learned or read about that made you say, I want to do this story and do the history of the Metropolitan Museum?
Well, I'm afraid that that's not actually how it happened.
All right, tell us how it happened.
As I said, I had written this book called 740 Park. That
right.
was the story of the most expensive and sought-after apartment building in New York. It's where the richest families in New York have lived for 75, 80 years.
Mm-hmm.
And the publishing industry, the book business, wants you to repeat yourself effectively, to be a recognizable entity, to write books that are similar to each other. But anyone who's involved in a creative profession wants to not repeat themselves. So there's a fascinating conflict there, and you have to find a way to negotiate that conflict. So what I thought to myself was, the natural next book would be a different apartment building, but I don't want to do that. Why don't I instead look at other institutions of American wealth? And just as 740 Park let me look at the residential ambitions of American wealth, I thought, why not find an institution that will allow me to look at a different aspect of the history of wealth in America? And there was a long list of possible institutions that I could write about. One of them was the Metropolitan. arrived at without terribly much thought, and my publisher was extremely enthusiastic about that particular book.
Oh, and I could understand why.
And I thought, well, gee, in exactly the same way that I wrote about their residential ambitions, here I can write about both their cultural and their philanthropic lives and times, and that would be a very different and very interesting thing to write about. Now, that was really all I thought walking into that 4 or 5 month long conversation with the museum. And of course, the museum's intransigent, bizarre attitude towards effectively a reporter telephoning. One of the most telling things that they said to me was, the only kind of books we find even vaguely palatable are those we control.
Okay, so you finally, though, in 2006, met with Philippe de Montebello, and he was, as you put it, quote, not happy to see you, and tried very hard to get rid of you. And I want to get to the point where finally you did find a way around that. And tell my listeners about the gentleman, the 89-year-old retired Dietrich von Bothmer, who was the curator emeritus of classic Greek and Roman art. He still had an office at the Met, and you made contact with him. So tell us about how the beginning of that and then the end result of that attempt.
Well, Dr. von Bothmer was at that point in his late 80s. He's since died. Mm-hmm. And I had been told that he was dying and that he was somebody I ought to talk to. The senior staff of the Metropolitan had already been ordered, shortly after my very first conversation with their publicity department. A memo went out to the senior staff of the museum saying, don't talk to Michael Gross. And so, I had an immediate challenge of who was going to talk to me. And on hearing that Dr. von Bothmer's health was bad, and that I ought to get to him, I thought, well, gee, maybe he didn't get that memo. Maybe he's too old to care. He's got stories to tell. He's dying. This would be very interesting. And I wrote him a letter, and a meeting was arranged. And during the course of that meeting, 2 curators walked into his office, 2 younger curators. I was introduced to one of them who asked me very pointedly whether I had been sent by the museum's publicity department. And I explained to her that, no, I was an independent author writing a book about the Metropolitan. That was probably a mistake, but I tend to try to be transparent and honest about what I'm doing at all times. And I can only assume that curator informed the administration at the museum that I had been interviewing him, because the next morning when I returned to do the second hour of the interview, because as I said, he was an elderly man, I didn't want to tire him out, so I was doing an hour at a time.
And he was very enthusiastic about meeting with you.
He was having a great time.
Yes.
I enjoyed him immensely. He's a charming, roguish character. One of the rogues of the title, although they are all of a different, each is different from the next.
Right.
And that second conversation was basically headed off at the pass by a senior vice president, the chief lawyer of the museum, who basically said, get out of here. And I wouldn't say she threw me out of the museum. I would rather say she stiffly smiled me out of the museum.
I like that analogy.
And I was not allowed to continue that conversation. So, these kind of hurdles were being thrown at me right from the beginning of the experience of trying to report the book.
Well, I know you're very busy, and I hear phones ringing in the background, but we're just going to ignore those and
we're
just
going
talk
to ignore
over
them, and it will go into voicemail because you are more important to me.
Well, thank you. You are being cut off a little bit, so you might have call waiting on the line you're talking on, but we're going to try to deal with all of that. And give me just, at this point of time, just a very brief, before we have to take our break, idea, and we'll get back to it. How did all of this behind-the-scenes stuff of trying to shut you up reach the attention of the public? Did you then write an article about it?
Did I write
Yeah.
about?
How did it get out there? Because it did finally reach the attention somehow, as I recall, from your earlier discussion at the Literary Society. Um, am I incorrect in that?
Well, I think that there were some bloggers on the internet who became aware that I was having some issues with the museum, but I don't think that came out until we were trying to get a picture of the museum for the jacket of the book.
Mm-hmm.
And the museum tried to stop an independent photographic agency from selling a picture of the museum to my publisher for the jacket of the book. And a blogger did get wind of that. But I think that really the story of my difficulties became the introductory chapter to the book. I had gone to the Rockefeller family archives, which I knew about from a previous book, because I knew that John D. Rockefeller Jr. had created the cloisters. And that's all I knew. But in the archives, I discovered that the story of the Rockefeller family involvement with the museum was much broader, deeper, and longer than I or really anyone had any idea. And that gave me the clue that if I was lucky, I would be able to find archival material that was outside of the control of the museum. And that was basically what I was able to do straight through from the museum's founding in 1870 until about 107 years later, because for each period of the museum's history, I was able to find a cache of material that explained a lot about the museum. So the book is actually organized around a series of pivotal people, luckily, who kept records of their involvement with the museum.
How were you able to gain access to those records and papers?
The first part of the book is focused on the first director of the museum, whose name was Luigi Palma di Cesnola. And his life was very much told in the newspapers in New York during that period of time when the newspapers and the government of New York were opposed to the museum.
Mm-hmm.
So that was very well covered publicly. The museum was then essentially taken over by Pierpont Morgan, the great financier. And although he never wrote anything down, he left his entire estate and all of his artworks to his son Jack. And Jack wrote everything down, and all of that was in the Morgan archives. The next part of the book is about Rockefeller, and as I said, there was a complete record of his involvement, incredibly surprising and at that point unknown involvement with the museum at the Rockefeller archives.
He was keeping it quiet, was he, that he was involved in donating and so forth?
He was a model philanthropist.
Yes.
He was egoless. He often gave donations and demanded that his name not be attached to them.
Good for him.
Whereas rich people today lust for a seat on the board of trustees of the Metropolitan, John D. Rockefeller Jr. turned it down repeatedly. He didn't want those honors. He didn't want any of that. He wanted to do good work, and he did. The next part of the book is actually focused on a figure from outside of the museum, Robert Moses, the great urban planner. And it's another untold story. I was reading a dissertation by a scholar about the museum, and it referenced some documents in the municipal archives of the city of New York. And there I found a complete record of 40 years of the museum's history, all put into the archives by Moses, who, as commissioner of parks of New York City, was the museum's landlord. He, too, was violently opposed to these trustees. He thought they were the most arrogant people on the face of the earth. And he made it his life's work to make them responsive to the public. And that entire story is told in the archives.
And I want to interrupt you here for my listeners that have just tuned in and say that I am talking to the interesting Michael Gross about his fascinating new book, Rogues Gallery. Go on from there, Michael.
And so Moses actually forced his way onto all the committees that ran the museum, and there was a complete archive of that material in the city archives. The next part of the book was clearly going to have to be about Tom Hoving, who died earlier this week, sadly. Hoving was a figure of revolutionary importance not only to the Met but to museums around the world, but he also became a figure of significant disdain because after he was forced out of the museum, he wrote a couple books in which he told tales out of school. And unbeknownst to me, he had done that by copying every single piece of paper that passed through his hands during the decade that he was the director of the Met. And his relationship with the museum after he was forced out was very, very bad, so he had no particular interest in keeping its secrets. And so after I interviewed him and he got a sense of what kind of book I wanted to write, he actually gave me the key to the storeroom in which those 10 years of documents were stored, and basically said, have fun. Didn't stop me from looking at anything. I could look at whatever I wanted. That took the story up to 1976. Then the question was, how do you tell the story of the current day when everyone in the current day has been ordered not to speak to you?
Well, can I get back to Hoving? Why and how did they force him out? Just briefly, of course, but why did that happen?
The question of did he jump or was he pushed? Tom was an immensely complicated character. And after 10 years at the museum, he had stepped on a lot of toes. He had made a lot of enemies. He was unhappy in the job, and it showed. And his enemies were really out to get him. He had made some bad moves during the course of his tenure that caused some bad publicity. The trustees backed him until it just became untenable. And at that point, it's an interesting story because it depends on who you're talking to. It's a did he jump or was he pushed story. And I don't want to spoil it by giving you too much detail because I think it would be better if people actually read it in the book. But you know, the point was that his days there were over. And he was maneuvered out of his job. The question is, did he maneuver the museum or did the museum maneuver him?
And maybe it was a little of both, don't you think?
People have to draw their own conclusions about that. Exactly. But Tom was, and I think, you know, in these days surrounding his death, he will be remembered more fondly than he was remembered in the last years of his life when the museum disdained him. I suspect that the museum will be embracing and probably attempting to rewrite his legacy and claim responsibility for it. So when he left, he had put in place a successor named Philippe de Montebello. The natural person to focus the last 30 years of the book on was Montebello, but I didn't find him a particularly interesting character. He was really much more of a caretaker or a maintenance man who perfected Hoving's innovations rather than an innovator himself. And it turned out that I had right on my desk the most fascinating character of the last 30 years, who was a trustee named Jane Engelhard. And the best way to sum this up is the Jane Engelhard story is the movie Casablanca if it had been rewritten by Edith Wharton.
Well, that was going to be my next question. Who was the woman with the most influence and the most interesting character at the museum? Now, you found her interesting. Did she have a lot of influence as well?
Well, I think that there were two women, both named Jane, who came into the museum's orbit in the 60s and the 70s and became vastly influential. One was Jane Reitzman, who was married to an oil man named Charlie Reitzman, a very erudite collector, a self-made woman, incredibly generous, a great philanthropist, and a major figure in the museum's history. But what made Jane Engelhard more interesting to me was that she effectively bequeathed her seat on the board of trustees of the museum to her daughter, who is today known as Annette de la Renta, and is the vice chairman of the Metropolitan Museum and was the co-head of the search committee that found the latest director, Tom Campbell, who just succeeded Philippe de Montebello.
And Jane de la Renta is the wife of the famous Oscar.
Annette de la Renta is the wife of the famous fashion designer and dressmaker Oscar de la Renta.
A powerhouse couple.
And Jane Engelhard and her daughter Annette were important not because of their erudition or particularly their generosity, although Jane Engelhard's husband did give a lot of money to the museum. They were influential because of the social circle that they represented, which essentially took over the museum and became the vortex, the thing that attracted both attention and other people's money to the museum, particularly around a rather small aspect of the museum that looms very large in its public image, which is called the Costume Institute. And, just as Hollywood has the Oscars, fashion in New York is a huge business, and it has the Costume Institute Party, which has become the most significant social event of the year at the Met, the most visible event of the year at the Met, and really has come to define, for better or worse, the museum in a lot of people's minds. It's a very controversial thing. It has caused a lot of negative comment about the museum over the last 30 years. And so I felt that Jane Engelhardt and Annette de la Renta really represented what the Met had become far better in a way than even Philippe de Montebello.
Well, that's a fascinating story. I'd also like to ask a question relating to the characters that you're talking about in the book. Which was, in your opinion, the most unusual character or bizarre, or however you want to word that? Someone else that, they're all unusual and interesting in their own way, but was there another one in particular that you found was really just kind of blew your mind when you started researching?
Well, you really are asking me which of my children is my favorite.
Yes, I know I am.
I'll
try to answer.
The artist who actually created the cloisters was a sculptor named George Gray Barnard, who was a fascinating kind of study in why the Metropolitan Museum does not want to deal with living artists. Never has, never will, hates living artists. And the story of George Gray Barnard's relationship with John D. Rockefeller Jr. will let anyone understand why rich people don't like having artists around, even though they like art.
Let me ask you here to tell our listeners what the cloister is, because we may have some people here that are not familiar with it. Just quickly.
It's the only off-site branch of the Metropolitan. It's essentially a Gothic museum in the heights of Upper Manhattan, built from Gothic period stone taken from cloisters and other religious institutions, brought to America mostly by George Gray Barnard, and then reconstructed in a place called Fort Tryon Park by John D. Rockefeller Jr. It's one of the most beautiful, calming, relaxing, extraordinary places in New York, and a must-see for anyone who's never been there.
Well, and it was my favorite place when I lived back east. I loved the cloisters. Mm-hmm. Absolutely amazing.
So, and then on the opposite side, another person who fascinated me, whose story is well told in the book, is a man named Erwin Untermeyer, whose father had been an immensely wealthy lawyer. Untermeyer didn't inherit his father's total estate, but somehow in his madness decided that he wanted to prove that he had better taste than his mother and father. They had collected wildly, broadly, and badly. He didn't have the money to do that, so he collected very narrowly. He collected a few tiny aspects of the decorative arts and textiles, but he created erudite, brilliant, the best collections in the world of these peculiar little aspects of the decorative arts. But he was so obsessed with the stuff that he ignored his family. But this is not just ignoring your family. This is ignoring your family on such a grand scale that his wife and several of his children ended up committing suicide.
Oh, my goodness gracious.
And he ended up spending his last days with a curator who became his private curator, who, among other things, he forced to cut his toenails. And this is the kind of stuff where if it was in a novel, people would say it was ridiculous.
Right.
But it's real life, and you cannot make this stuff up. And this is why I write nonfiction.
Well, and this is an amazing story. It's a kind of book that you're going to have to read and reread. Very quickly, who was it Tom Hoving or someone else that you feel was the more contemporary director that did open up the museum more to the public and created
I think first First, it was the director in the late 40s and 1950s whose name was Francis Henry Taylor. Taylor began the process. Then there was a lull during the James Rorimer years. Rorimer also helped popularize the museum, but he was more the ivory tower kind of guy and less the populist. And he actually groomed Hoving in the same way that Hoving groomed de Montebello. And he ended up, his late wife ended up hating Hoving because she felt that that Hoving had not given Rorimer enough credit. His name was James Rorimer. Had not given Rorimer enough credit for creating Hoving. But no, I think that in the history of museums, Tom Hoving will loom very, very large as the man who created the museum as popular spectacle and populist institution. It was really Tom Hoving who, with will and insanity and just a kind of beautiful craziness, made art museums accessible to everyone in a way that they had never been, and they will henceforth always be.
Well, I want to tell my listeners that we've been talking to Michael Gross about his new book, Rogues Gallery, The Secret History of the Moguls and the Money That Made the Metropolitan Museum. They can get it at their local bookstore. And just very quickly, please, Michael, I know what you're working on next, but tell our listeners what we can look forward to in your next book.
Well, my next book is a sequel to 740 Park set in Los Angeles. It's going to be a social history of the wealthy estate district of Los Angeles.
I can hardly wait for that one.
And if I could also add, if people want to know more about Rogues Gallery, they can visit my website, which is mgross.com, MGROSS.com.
And it's a wonderful website. I've enjoyed it very much. And thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it, Michael. And we have to say goodbye, but I'm going to be following your career and looking forward to that next book. Good luck with it, and thank you so much.
And the same. Thank you.
You're welcome. This is the Jacqueline Bachar Show, and we'll be back in just a minute.